Well, thank you so much, and thank you for having us. Thank you for coming out on this gorgeous evening. And we were actually just discussing the fact that the mission of 20 Summers and, in fact, Woodwell Climate's vision have a lot in common. Our vision is a healthy, equitable, and sustainable future. We just pursue it in a slightly different way, which is through science in partnership with leaders and communities that can help us get to better decision-making and solutions. But that requires a lot of imagination and creativity. And I think, to say that certainly my colleagues up here know what they're talking about, but that doesn't mean that scientists have all the answers. I think we really do need to bring solutions and ideas from all sorts of different places. So anyway, I'm Heather Goldstone. I'm Chief Communications Officer at Woodwell Climate Research Center. And I'm just here to help these fine colleagues of mine show what they know tonight. So I'm going to just, I guess I'll just kind of let each of you introduce yourselves a little bit to get started, starting with Brendan Rogers, who is a scientist in our Arctic program.
Yeah, hello everyone. Nice to meet you and glad to be up here. Thank you. So I'm a scientist at Woodwell Climate Research Center. I've been there for a little over 9 years. What I study are the high latitudes, so the Arctic and boreal systems across Alaska, Canada, Eurasia, Siberia, and mainly because the climate is changing so quickly there. I remember the moment I decided I wanted to study those systems, I was looking at a map of global temperature change and warming and saw these huge red blobs at the high latitudes. It was like, that looks important, and it is, and I'll tell you a lot more about that, specifically with fires. So a lot of my work looks at how quickly the climate is changing there, but what that really means for the ecosystems, what that means for policy and natural resource management. And so Woodwell is a perfect place to be doing that. Yeah. I'll pass it to Mike.
Great. I'm Mike Coe. I am a climatologist by training. I've been at Woodwell now for 18 years, a little over 18 years. And my background is really in tropical climate, and how the land surface interacts with the climate, how forests are part of the climate system. And I really fell in love with the Amazon in particular when I saw the river for the first time, and knowing that it's an environment that still can be saved, whereas a lot of places that I'd worked previously had already been turned into farmland. So I'll turn it over to Marcia.
Hi, everyone. I'm Marcia Macedo. I am also a scientist at Woodwell. I'm director of our water program. I am Brazilian, and I kind of became interested in the Amazon, I think, when I was a kid. My dad's family is from Belém, which is right at the mouth of the Amazon, and got a chance to take a trip when I was about 12 years old and kind of got really interested in the ecology. Just was really impressed by the richness of the ecosystem, the biodiversity, the river, pink river dolphins, all of that. And so I was kind of hooked back then, and then kind of took a meandering path to where I am today. In college, I studied primates. I thought I wanted to be a primatologist, Jane Goodall style, but in the Amazon. And then the more time I spent sort of in these systems, watching agricultural expansion kind of deforest large swaths of the Amazon, for example, I decided I kind of wanted to take a step back and think about more big picture habitat conservation and kind of how do we make sure that the system is around to allow monkeys to exist and all of the other amazing things that the forest provides. So, yeah.
So I think that's a great, you'll see why these are the folks we have up here. But what we're going to do this evening is a little bit of compare and contrast, essentially. Curious if anybody saw the news this week that Allstate has basically pulled out of insuring in California due to wildfire risk. So fire is changing, and we see those changes in the news on a regular basis. We've got smoke that's been hanging over us here this past week from Nova Scotia, wildfires in Nova Scotia. So we're seeing these changes all over the place, and what we're going to do this evening is a little bit of a compare and contrast between how fire is changing in the boreal, in the high latitudes, and how it's changing in the tropics. So Mike, actually, I'm going to start with you, and you mentioned your interest in how forests are part of the climate system. So give us a taste of that. What do forests do in a climate sense?
Well, until a few years ago, we really didn't quite understand just how important they are. There are two big things that a forest does. And I think the first we're all pretty familiar with. They take carbon out of the atmosphere. A tree, when it photosynthesizes, is pulling CO2 out of the atmosphere and sequestering it. And that's a great way to mitigate climate change right there. Just by having forests constantly pulling carbon out of the atmosphere, you're taking about 25% of all human emissions out. They're doing a huge job there. The second thing they're doing is when they're pulling in CO2, they're evaporating water, a lot of water. And that is just a giant air conditioner. It's exactly how an air conditioner works in essence. It's evaporating water and removing that heat and putting it somewhere else, essentially in the atmosphere where it can, radiate to space. So you've got these two big things. And, when you look at that second one, the impact of the air conditioner, it's huge. Where we work in Brazil, you can walk out of the forest and into a farm field, and the temperature will jump by 10 degrees Fahrenheit just in 100 yards. It's like you go from a hot environment to a frying pan when you do that. So altogether, that we started looking at those numbers, and it turns out that if you deforested all the tropics, you would raise the temperature of the planet by 1 degree C. We've already raised the temperature of the planet 1.25, or a little more than that. So that's a big number. So if you deforest 10%, you raise the temperature by 0.1 degrees C. And that temperature change is from those two things. Half is from the CO2 and half is from the air conditioner that you break when you cut the trees down. So
So it's a huge effect, and that's tropical forest.
That's tropical.
I feel like, I don't know, the Discover Channel and others have done a great job of all of us feeling like we have some mental image of what the Amazon rainforest or a tropical rainforest looks like. Boreal forests are a little bit more mysterious. So, Brendan, what does a boreal forest kind of look like, and what role do those forests, because I think they're also, besides being less well known, they're definitely less well appreciated in terms of the really huge impact that they have in our climate system.
Cool. Yeah. Well, I guess I would ask anyone in the audience, has anyone been to a boreal forest? Okay, that counts.
We're going to be generous here.
So, yeah, I mean, I'm in love with boreal forests. What defines boreal? It's basically areas that are cold. And it's defined by tree species that can live in areas that are cold. And by cold, I mean that frequently get below about negative 40 degrees Celsius and Fahrenheit. They're about the same there. Because the trees need special adaptations to live in those environments. So there's not a lot of them. If you have, say about a dozen different tree species, you can cover most of all the boreal environments across Alaska and Canada and Eurasia. But when I go to a boreal forest, I feel very primeval in a way. They're vast. They cover, they're about a third of all forests globally. But one of the things they do is they store an immense amount of carbon. So when you're walking in these forests, often it's very squishy. It's sort of peaty. It feels almost like you're walking on a waterbed, because what you're walking on is called duff or soil organic matter. It's just in often places very, very thick. And it's because of the cold climate. So like in the tropics, the trees are photosynthesizing, but because it's so cold, the opposite side of that, the decomposition or respiration is relatively slow. So over thousands and thousands of years, they've stored a lot of carbon. So, they represent about a third of forests globally, but they store roughly about 2/3 of global forest carbon. And it's not in the trees. The trees are often pretty small. It's underground. It's what's under your feet when you're walking through them. So somewhere around like 90% of the carbon they store is underground, and a lot more actually if they're on permafrost. So permafrost are areas where it's the soils are frozen for at least 2 consecutive years. So that is one big way that the boreal forests affect climate. Of course, the problem is that it's warming now, and so as it warms up, those microbes start to wake up and become more active. That decomposition starts to increase, and we have things like fires that are increasing and intensifying, and those also release quite a bit of carbon. So it is something that we're kind of concerned about because of how much carbon could be coming out of these forests, and the fact that it's largely not accounted for when we think about global climate policy climate trajectories or global climate policy. It's really not accounting for this, and there's a bunch of reasons for that, but I'd say carbon is one of the biggest reasons that we're sort of worried about how quickly things are changing in the boreal forests.
All right, so we're going to do compare and contrast, but I'm going to try not to give us whiplash. So we're going to stay with boreal for just a little bit longer, since you already mentioned that warming and fire are increasingly a part of these, what should be very cold forests. So how much and how is fire changing, and has it always been part of these forests?
Yeah, so it always has. I mean, it almost sounds a little strange because you think of these places as being very cold, and they are for a lot of the year. But in the summer, they warm up. The type of sort of surface moss and vegetation can dry out, and so fires happen. They mostly get ignited by lightning. They're a part of the natural landscape. They've been there for a long, long time. They are critical for some habitat and sort of different tree species in the environment. But again, the problem is that the climate is warming, and so now we have longer fire seasons. We can snow melt earlier in the season. We have more extreme fire weather, so kind of like hot, dry conditions that sit over an area and dry out the fuels. And we have more lightning emissions, actually, because the atmosphere can hold more energy, and so they tend to get this more intense lightning storms throughout the summer. So, it's kind of a rough sort of rule of thumb. We have about double of the burned area annually in the boreal than we used to have, say, 50 or 60 years ago. And now is a serendipitous time to be talking about it. So as Heather mentioned, I don't know if folks noticed, when I drove to work on Tuesday, I got out of my car and I was like, oh, someone's burning brush around here. It was the fires from Nova Scotia, right? So at that time, the wind was sort of carrying smoke relatively close, so you could sort of smell it. It was in the lower parts of the atmosphere, but often we'll get, I don't know, the sunsets have been gorgeous lately, and a lot of that's from the Canada fire, so that's higher up in the atmosphere. But and in May was a large fire year for lots of parts of Canada, Alberta, now Saskatchewan, British Columbia. There are already over 3 million hectares. It's not just a sort of climate and environment phenomena. There's thousands of people that are being evacuated currently. Hundreds of homes have already been destroyed, and so it's a very human centered problem as well as a environmental and climate issue. And so, unfortunately, as the climate continues to warm, these things we expect to continue to happen, and we expect fires to continue and sort of intensifying. And there are things we can do about it. We'll talk about that later, but yeah, this is what's happening.
So we've got our cold northern forests are getting hotter, drier, more larger, more intense fires as a result primarily of climate change. Marcia, let's go back to Brazil and the Amazon. How is fire changing there? How has it changed over the past few decades, and what's driving some of that?
Well, our warm tropical forests are also drying and getting hotter and having more fires. And that's a really big problem because the trees there are not adapted to fire. Fire is absolutely not a natural part of the Amazon system. So there are no natural ignition sources. All the ignition sources are man-made. And even when there were those ignition sources, say, in 2006, when I started doing my graduate degree, it was very rare that a fire could really carry overnight, say, because you hit dew point and the fire goes out. So you might have kind of a small blaze if it escapes into the forest, and then it kind of goes out, and that has changed completely since then. So there, at the time there was a paper that I remember that came out that pointed out that indigenous lands are these amazing fire breaks, right? They're like these big forested protected areas, never burn. You see fire all around them, like all around the boundary, and nothing inside for years, decades. And now we see fire entering those areas. And that is from ignition sources outside mostly, but also because the forest is drier. We have, invasive grasses sometimes that are very flammable and kind of help make that connection from agricultural lands outside to the forest. And we do have multi-day fires. We have, in very dry years, we have more extreme drought events. We see big fires that get out of control. They're very remote areas. There's really no kind of infrastructure to deal with that because it's never been a part of the system before. So yeah, it's a new world in terms of fire in those areas, and I think we're kind of scrambling to figure out how to manage that.
Mike, let's take a step back and talk specifically about those ignition sources and what comes before we actually have a fire started. What's driving really the whole fire cycle in the Amazon?
Yeah, that's in this. Marcy gets to it. Fires are not natural. They're always associated essentially with deforestation or management of land. And so, when we've been studying that subject for quite a long time in Brazil. And when you look at tropics in general, these forests are still doing what they're supposed to be doing, which is cooling the planet. But then if you start looking regionally, you see that there's a lot of places where that's not the case at all. We're reversing that cycle. Essentially, through deforestation, we're putting carbon in the atmosphere, and then we're making the land hotter. We're making conditions much more appropriate for very large and frequent fires. And the result is this is what we've seen. We've experienced this now, where it's if you're getting droughts occurring in these regions twice in a decade or 3 times in a decade, which again, that was not something that occurred, and now it does. So now when there is a fire, it's much worse and much more damage. So we look at Brazil. They've deforested about 10,000 square kilometers last year, and the year before, and the year before. And we're on track to do that probably again this year. We've lost probably the same amount to fire. So there's 20,000 square kilometers being damaged or destroyed each year. So we're on a trajectory in some of these regions where we're taking the forest from being a climate solution to a climate problem.
And talk a little bit, Mike, and then Brendan, I think there's a parallel in the boreal about, you talked about the climate shifting to something that's appropriate for different trees, different ecosystems, essentially. What happens after fire, and how does that potentially play out on a longer term scale as we are losing tropical forests to deforestation and increasingly to fire?
And that's a lot of the work we've done, is trying to figure out where these forests are headed. Where might they be in 20 summers? It would be one way to look at this. And what's clear is if you have 2 fires in one decade at one place, you're really setting the forest up to just shift to an essentially different assemblage of species, both flora and fauna. So that it looks much, much more like a woody savanna or even a grassy savanna than it does a rainforest. So that we see that clearly where we work in the southeastern Amazon. And the worry there, from our perspective, when we started looking at this over the large scale, we realized about 40% of the Amazon has a climate that kind of transition could occur with just a little pushing by humans. So it's.
But if we cut down the trees, the trees wouldn't come back. What would come back would be something different. Is that essentially? You essentially shifting it from a rainforest to a savanna. Some form of savanna. Maybe a woody savanna, might be a grassy one, but you're completely changing it. And there's 40% of the Amazon that's kind of in this climate zone that wouldn't take very much to make that happen. Brendan, you've talked about that and kind of seen that in your work in the boreal as well, that it feels like the forests there are shifting in some places to a different kind of forest.
Yeah, exactly. So sometimes fire itself can be the main driver of change. Sometimes it acts as a catalyst to change that was otherwise going to happen. It is different in the sense that fire is a natural part of the landscape, right? So it's important. For example, moose, which are very, very important culturally and ecologically, much prefer younger forests. So we need fire in the boreal for a lot of reasons, but we're beyond that envelope, and we are seeing changes. So I have studied, for example, the southern boreal, where it's warming and you sort of get that transition from forest to grassland or steppe. And what we see there is more frequent fires. So for example, I had some work I did in southern Canada, and I was amazed by the young forests that were burning. So the kind of like typical model in the boreal is that you burn, especially in Alaska and Canada, these like stand replacing fires. They're very high intensity. It's actually really interesting. The forests have evolved for that. They sort of these large fires will come through, and then the pine and the spruce will set seed afterwards and grow. But they're happening more frequently, and if the fires come through and the trees are old enough to have cones and reproduce, then you don't have the seed stock, right? And so that's something we're seeing in the southern boreal, where we have more frequent fires, and then we're getting, it's kind of the same idea. We're getting more grassland and non-boreal systems. And it's a problem for fire management, which I know we'll come back to management, but I've talked with a lot of fire managers in Alaska, and one of their historical sort of frameworks is that they'll use these young burns as natural fire breaks when they're setting up their crews and trying to predict where the fire is going to go in the landscape, because the young vegetation is often less flammable, there's less fuels, but they're having to sort of abandon that now because the fire weather is much more extreme, and especially later in the fire season, they're getting, that no longer holds true. Also, this happens I mentioned permafrost before, so a lot of times you can get these abrupt changes in forests when there's permafrost underneath it, because what you do is that fire will sort of burn off a lot of the organic matter that is otherwise insulating the permafrost. It's kind of like taking the lid off a cooler. So you can get permafrost thaw. In some places, if there's a lot of ground ice, that'll lead to sort of like landscape collapse and degradation. So we're seeing those kind of changes. The other interesting change we're seeing is at the sort of ecotone between, so the very north part of it, sort of boreal up to tundra, where you get sparser and sparser trees. And that's where we're getting the greatest relative increase in lightning ignitions. So places that used to have very few or no lightning ignitions are getting lightning. And so we're seeing fires there. And it's a little bit more academic, but we're seeing changes in those environments, and there's reasons why that could enhance forest expansion, because you expose different kinds of soil that trees like to reproduce on, but you also kill the trees, and sometimes they're seed sources. So we don't really know how fire is going to play out in the ecotone, but yeah, it's a rapidly changing environment. And back to the 20 summers analogy, I think the boreal forest that I know and have known is in a lot of places is going to look a lot different in 20 years.
So you mentioned forest management. We've talked so far a lot about the changes and the problems and the impacts. What do we do about this? And you mentioned forest management or fire management. How much a part of the solution or a better path forward might fire management be for the boreal?
Good question, Heather. So it's a really interesting subject. One of the ways that I come at that is that a lot of the sort of these Earth system processes and feedbacks we look at, some of them we just don't have a lot of control over. We do put a lot of resources into fire and forest management. And so one of the things I've been thinking about and working on for the boreal is, could we think about fire management there a little bit differently, and think about it as a climate solution? By no means a silver bullet, right? Because ultimately all of the stuff that I'm talking about is driven by climate change. So at the end of the day, it's reducing fossil fuels and working towards a more sustainable future. That said, I think at this point we sort of need help from all the different sectors that we can get help from. And so we've been looking at the issue of fire management in boreal systems, and I actually think there's a lot of opportunity there. So for example, we've worked on some of the economics, and it turns out fire managers are good at what they do. And so if you put the sort of dollars and cents together with some of the ecological data, we estimated that even though sort of protecting carbon and limiting fire size is not, a lot of times, not necessarily the goal of the managers, what they have done is actually pretty effective at it. And so our estimates are that it costs about $13 a ton of CO2 to keep that CO2 in the ground, to use fire suppression to keep these fires at sort of minimal levels. We would never suggest going sort of below historical levels, right? But it looks like it's relatively cost effective. It's complicated. The boreal systems are very different than the Western U.S., where we have a history of fire suppression that has led to more intense fires. So I can talk about that, but I think in some places, both ecologically, culturally, and from a climate perspective, it could definitely make sense to put more resources into fire management, and specifically to protect carbon while we're working towards sort of deep reductions globally. And what was really exciting is doing this work and talking with people, especially in Alaska. Just a few months ago, for the first time in the U.S., a land management agency has designated land. This is it's called Yedema permafrost. It's permafrost with a lot of ground ice. So if it were to burn, it would often lead to landscape collapse and a lot of greenhouse gas emissions. So they just a couple months ago designated about 1.6 million acres to an increased fire protection status to keep that permafrost intact. So again, I don't think it's any kind of silver bullet, but I think in some areas where we're seeing intensified fire regimes, where we're seeing a lot of emissions come out, this could make sense. And, how could this look on the ground? I mean, when we're in conditions seeing like we're seeing in Canada right now, the fires are already huge and fire weather is intense. That's not what we're talking about. We're actually talking about sort of more technology, flexibility, resources for attacking the fires right after they start. So for example, in Alaska, most fires start in June, but most of the bird area is actually in July. They take a while to get big on average. And so what we're thinking about is going after those fires when they're small in areas where it makes sense to protect carbon. And I think it could be, it has a lot of potential, but again, not a silver bullet.
Right. Here we're talking about ultimately the solution is addressing climate change, the global problem that is driving the changes in fire regimes. We've got, I mean, obviously that's a big and ultimately the solution in the Amazon as well, but there's also a difference in that there is a direct human driver of the fires in the Amazon, deforestation and fire cycle. So I wonder how much of the solution or how much emphasis should we be putting on fire management in the Amazon as part of addressing what's going on there now?
A lot. Yeah, I mean, a fire anywhere kind of needs three ingredients to like go forward, right? You need climate that's like dry enough, and you need a fuel, and you need an ignition source, right? And so the big picture climate problem is a longer term solution, right? Like reducing global greenhouse gases to the level where we're not having these extreme events. Locally, we can do a lot about kind of the regional climate by not deforesting. I mean, Mike talked a lot about kind of the direct local impact of deforestation. So that's already kind of one big thing that we can do. And yeah, I mean, the big ignition source is really deforestation. We know that deforestation is a climate negative. There's a lot of efforts to kind of get deforestation down to zero. And I think that's really well placed. And with that, you get a big reduction in ignition sources. And then I think there's some innovation that can happen in land management, and that's already happening in some places. Like we don't need to burn pastures in order to renew them. There are other ways that we can manage pastures, and doing some extension work and getting some of those technologies into the hands of land managers is a big piece of it. Those are the kind of two fire ignition sources in the landscape. And then, just monitoring and enforcement. I mean, I think Brazil in particular has a really state-of-the-art monitoring and enforcement system. I think some of the agencies that do that work need more reliable data about, say, where a fire started, right? Like you need particular kinds of data to do enforcement reliably, to fight a fire effectively, and to kind of manage the landscape. And so one of the things that we've been really working on is kind of figuring out, okay, like what do you need to do your job well, right? Like how can we shorten the path between raw data and the information you need to prosecute where a fire started, or in the case of firefighters, what do you need to know about the conditions in the landscape to very efficiently kind of mobilize your teams and get them where they need to be to keep these fires from escaping? And if you don't have the resources, how do we get the resources to you? And so we've been doing a lot of work with the state fire brigades of Mato Grosso and Pará, which are a big part of that 40%. They're huge states in the eastern Amazon that are kind of at the center of where fire dynamics are changing, and just talking to them and figuring out, okay, how are you using data? What are the kind of workflows that we can help you kind of do more efficiently? How do we automate that? And that's been really great. We've had some scientists kind of be embedded with them in the field and understand kind of what the field conditions are like, and how they're using kind of the Windy app on their cell phone, and whatever data you can get from the Brazilian Space Agency on a computer. So 5 different data sources, 6 different apps, and they're trying to integrate that and put people in the field where they need to be. And we can do better, and we're trying to kind of help that process speed up. Indigenous fire brigades have also been. I mean, though there's very large areas that are designated as indigenous lands. and there are people there who can kind of, again, catch the fire right when it starts before it gets out of control. But sometimes they need, particular kinds of training in terms of how do you use spatial data to think about, okay, where's the fire going to go? And so we've been doing some training in spatial analysis and also in, a bit of kind of connecting some of these state agencies and the indigenous communities so that they're coordinating resources as well. So those are a few of the things that we've been working on. And yeah,
I love where you started there, because go back talking about ignition sources and deforestation as fire management. I think we tend to think of, technically fire prevention and fire management are, kind of different things, but right, that is the ultimate fire management, is to prevent them. And that means preventing deforestation. Mike, I wonder if you could put a little bit more of a human face on what that means, right? There are different actors, different landholders in the Amazon. How do we work with those folks and with the systems that we have, or create new systems to actually stop deforestation and stop the fire cycle at its root?
Yeah, and that's a lot of the fun work I think we do. Marcia talked about enforcement. That's the stick. The state has to say you can't do this, but then we have to create carrots. We have to figure out how to work with the land stewards, give them opportunities to be prosperous and to conserve their forests. And the nice thing in many ways about, say, the Amazon and really most tropical locations, there are really only 4 groups of land stewards. There's, indigenous and traditional people. There are very small family farms. There are large family farms or large corporate farms and concessions, like mining concessions. And there's the government. Those 4 groups control the forest. And that's, so for each of those, we just have to think about what motivations could we incentivize? And what could we get them? How could we motivate them to conserve forests while providing what they need, which is, they got to make a living somehow, and so like with small farms, a huge problem there is that they just have, they're out in an environment which is a very tough environment. They have very little land. They have no technical training whatsoever. They're just trying to survive. And so there we found that a really good method here is to give them technical training so that they know how to grow things, what kind of things to grow, how to get access to markets so they can sell their things, and not deforest, because basically they just deforest in order to make a little bit of cash, and until they run out of forest. And so the idea is to turn this little family farm into a working industry with just a little support. With the big farms, there are all kinds of, the big farms, they've got a lot of land that they could legally deforest. They could legally cut it down and grow more crops. But so one of the things we're investigating is essentially just paying them not to deforest, renting the land. Any forest they have, we pay them a certain price to keep it in forest. And then we monitor that, like crazy. Indigenous groups, a lot of that is just sharing knowledge and technology back and forth, giving them just enough, helping them get just enough information so they can manage what they have better. Again, it's kind of going back to Marcia saying, often fires are affecting them, or deforestation is affecting their properties, and they don't know where, they don't know who, so you just, with a little bit of knowledge, it's perhaps easier to manage their property. So for each of these groups, we just try to think of how we could help them do what they need to do.
So that's a framework in terms of those 4 broad categories of landholders that extends well beyond the Brazilian Amazon. But Brenda, I'm curious, it sparks a question about boreal forests. Who are the landholders, the land managers for those forests?
Actually extremely complicated. So the short answer is, I said it also very much depends on the country we're talking about. But in the U.S., our boreal land is in Alaska, so I'll focus there. There are multiple state and federal agencies and native corporations that own the land. So they're called jurisdictional agencies. And then there are, layered on top of that, what are called fire protection agencies. So in the northern half of Alaska, it's the federal government, it's the Bureau of Land Management, the Alaska Fire Service, and the sort of central part of Alaska, it's the state of Alaska. And in the lower sort of southeast part, it's the U.S. Forest Service, and amazingly, it works. They share resources. In large fire years, they will share resources with Canada and even the western U.S. One thing that I know the fire managers are very concerned about is if there is a very large fire year, for example, in the western U.S. and Alaska, because then sharing the resources would be much harder. But I think when we look towards the future and think about doing fire management differently, I think we can. Well, one thing I think we can do is learn a lot from communities that have been fire stewards on the land for thousands of years, and that's indigenous communities, right? And I think there's a lot of work to be done there. So paradoxically, a lot of these systems, if you do burn them, say early in the fire year or late in the fire season, you're not going to emit hardly as much carbon at all because you're not going to be burning deeply into the soil. You're mainly just going to be burning the surface, and you'll lead to sort of less flammability. And indigenous cultures have been doing that for... Just because it's colder. Yeah, it's colder. The ground is frozen, so it's just not going to burn, right? Exactly. And so indigenous communities and cultures have been doing this for thousands of years, but they've been largely left out of the fire management conversation. So I think we have a lot to learn, ways we can work together, looking towards the future.
It seems one perhaps contrast between boreal and Amazon, I mean, we talked about a few, but is that when it comes to fire management, Brendan, you were saying that the primary goal of fire management in the boreal has typically been when fires get close to human settlements. It's been about protection of people and property. And you're trying to bring about a shift in thinking that also adds the value of those forests as climate solutions, right? In the Amazon, it feels kind of like the opposite, where to a large extent the desire for fire management or preventing fire has been for protection of the forest itself. But Marcia, you've been, in addition to working with indigenous fire brigades on fire management, installing or working with indigenous communities to install air quality monitors that can monitor smoke. And I wonder where kind of the human health and protection of human communities fits in the thinking about fire management, and whether there's a shift or a possible motivator there to bring more attention to the human health impacts of fires.
Yeah, I mean, I would say yes, and I think certainly funders. There's a lot of funding calls right now around health and the health climate connection, like using the health impacts as a way to motivate people to care about climate change and do something about it. Our work with the smoke sensors was almost a curiosity, it was and also personal experience, right? Like being in these regions during big fire years. I mean, we could smell the smoke on Tuesday and made me cough a little bit, but it blew away, right? When you're in kind of the southeastern Amazon and it's a big fire year, it's weeks, sometimes a month, where the smoke just kind of sits there, and it's really intense, kind of respiratory. We know all the respiratory problems. We know that in cities there's a clear correlation between kind of biomass burning, like smoke exposure, and all sorts of morbidities and mortality eventually, and people being hospitalized, etc. In rural areas, we don't really have that data. Like, people are far from a hospital. They're not really going to a hospital if they have a cough or asthma or whatever. So I looked at the Purple Air. Purple Air is the name of this low-cost sensor that Heather mentioned. Looked at the Purple Air website. Anybody can look on their phones, and there was just a big blank spot over the Amazon in these areas where I knew that there were smoke plumes for like weeks on end. And so I was like, well, that seems wrong, right? I mean, those people are breathing bad air too. And so we got a grant to just buy 50 of these and kind of partner with people, try to spread them out as much as possible. It does rely on internet to make it kind of part of that global network. And so we were a little bit limited, but we got 50 of them installed. The last one was just installed yesterday, actually. And the motivation there is really to just document, right? To understand the exposure of populations in these rural areas where there is no air quality warning, right? Like, in a city, you get a warning like bad air quality, don't go outside. In these areas, even if you got that warning, you wouldn't necessarily be able to go inside. But I think having that information and understanding the level of exposure both gives Indigenous people, in particular, kind of one more kind of piece of evidence to advocate for more resources to fight fires, but also, gives us arguments and the information we need to think about how to mitigate that, right? Like, one, yes, obviously motivate fire combat and prevention, but also get firefighters better equipment, right? If they're like way over where they're supposed to be in terms of exposure, get them better masks, or like rotate out the crews more often, or whatever it is. But we can't really come up with those kind of tactical strategies unless we know. And so that was kind of the first step, and that was the motivation.
So you mentioned in there what we can think about, what we can do, and believe it or not, time flies when you're having fun. We've been up here for 45 minutes talking about this. So each of you are going to the boreal, going to the Amazon, working with communities, they are clearly doing something actively. For the rest of us, these feel like potentially very far away places where we don't necessarily have a lot of agency. So what can those of us in this room that aren't next month headed off to either Alaska or Brazil for research, what can we do to try to affect change in these areas and make an impact on this way that fire is changing and the way that that's changing forests around the globe? You want to jump in?
Okay.
That's me, and you said who starts, so you get to start.
Okay. I mean, I guess I don't know if it's fortunate or unfortunate, but as we mentioned, the largest driver of change in the boreal environments is climate change. And so when I think about solutions to this, yes, there is a sort of on-the-ground component, working with communities, working with fire managers, but the ultimate driver still is climate change. So I think in large part it comes down to what can we do about climate change. And from my perspective, there's two main categories. So one is get the right people in office that care about this and are solutions oriented and are thinking long term about sustainability. That is very, very important. So yeah, voting, being politically active and aware. And I think it's a little bit complicated to talk about, but I think personal choices can and do matter too. When you think about ways that we transport ourselves or energy that we use or food that we eat, both because it does matter in a direct way. I also feel like it empowers people when they can make choices that are climate smart and they believe in, and it can affect the people around them, their colleagues and their friends and family. So I think there are a lot of ways that we can sort of make conscious choices, and also at the same time recognize that it's the weight is not on individual shoulders. It is collectively, and it is about the people in office making the right decisions as we move forward to avoid the worst outcomes of climate change and head us on a path towards stabilization and ultimately cooling. Yeah.
All right, Mike, do you want to jump in there?
Sure.
I mean,
Yeah.
I think with the Amazon, we often hear about the individual responsibility, individual choices part of it.
Yeah, for me, there's a lot of things we could do. The one I have been thinking about quite a bit lately is it's all about deforestation in this case. How do we end deforestation? Because that's being driven by people wanting to take the land in order to make some money. So for me, being here in the United States, I should expect to know where a product came from beginning to end. Where did the leather in this shoe come from? I have no idea, but I suspect it probably came.
It says made in Brazil.
Yeah, I suspect it came from Brazil via Vietnam, and was made somewhere else. Same with the car. Where do those leather car seats come from? Probably Brazil, but I don't know, and I have no way of knowing. We should expect to know so we can make choices.
So that's an interesting. Often people go straight to, we should take responsibility for where our things come from, and that probably leads to don't buy, and also puts a potentially unreasonable expectation on individuals to figure out where their stuff came from, because it's really hard. So what you're talking about is almost back to a collective action and advocacy and asking for systems that would at least allow us to make those informed choices.
Right. And so in Europe, they definitely have laws in place now that demand that. Corporations are now responsible for their supply chain. They have to show that they are where products come from and what they're doing to remove deforestation from those products. We should expect that. That should just be standard practice, I think. Know where things come from so I can make a decision one way or another.
I feel like it's hard to go last, right? There are no easy answers left. I mean, I would say something along those lines as well. Like we should expect to know, but also we have to keep paying attention and keep those things change, right? Like so it's soybeans today and the soybean supply chain, and it's leather tomorrow, and it's so I think we should expect to know, but we should also not kind of check out. And once we set kind of like find out the answer once, I think one thing I like to point out to U.S. audiences when I talk about kind of deforestation in the Amazon is that it really is connected to us pretty directly. Like I get these questions like, why do they keep deforesting? Don't they know? And I'm like, well, like, think about it, right? Like when Trump went kind of head to head with China and set up this sort of trade war, basically China stopped importing soy from the U.S. For a moment there for 1 year. And like the instant impact of that, the only other place on earth that could supply the demand for soybeans that China has was Brazil. And so like overnight, the price of soy went through the roof, and the incentives to kind of clear and to plant more soy. So you have these shocks that are very much connected to the global system. And I don't know if there's a solution in there, but I think being aware of those connections also shows us some of the levers where we can kind of force kind of big picture action, right? I mean, the Biden administration right now is considering big investments in the Amazon to help slow deforestation, and I think leather is one of the focal areas, right? Like just shutting down the leather supply chain that is tied to deforestation. Similar things in Europe back when soy was all going to Europe and it was associated with increasing deforestation. Consumers said, we don't want deforestation soy, and they kind of worked through the big buyers and it stopped. So we have power as consumers, but I think we do have to think about the big picture and where the kind of collective levers are to make that happen quickly. Yeah.
Might just build on what you were saying, and actually all of you, but these things change. They're not always easy to figure out. So first step, just staying curious. I mean, yeah, thank you again to all of you for coming out tonight. I mean, who learned something in the past 45 minutes, right? So just that first step of staying curious, right? There's a lot to know, and that can seem overwhelming. But I think, yeah, just staying curious and then share what you learn with other people, because there's nobody out there who knows it all and has all of the answers. Otherwise, we wouldn't be here. We would have solved it.